I get ideas from the world around me. I read a lot of newspapers, magazines, books, histories, watching what kinds of things are happening and what sorts of technologies people are using to make them happen. I could do a blog called The Blog of Hope, in which I put in the hopeful ones that might be encouraging at this point. So for The Handmaid's Tale, it was the age of, we didn't have an internet yet, so it's clippings. I have a big box of clippings. And for this, I would call them more like URLs and printouts. But my rule for both of these books was nothing goes in unless there's an example of that detail from somewhere in real life, and preferably several examples.
Well, I mean, was there a real life example which, when you learnt about it, you were like, wow, it blew your mind, it completely changed how you saw history? Like, what are those details that were really shocking?
I think we go back to about 1970 for that one. So in 1970, there was something called the War Measures Act in Canada, and in which there had been in connection with the separatism movement, there had been a murder and some explosions. And the government declared the War Measures Act, which allowed you to arrest people without a warrant. And a number of people were arrested without a warrant. And I found that shocking within the context of my country, which wasn't, quote, supposed to do things like that, but as it turns out has done them quite a bit. The history we were taught in school was pretty boring because they never put any of those things in. So at that point, I joined an organization called Amnesty International. And when you're a member of Amnesty International, you hear about a lot of shocking things. So I had a decade of shocking things before I wrote The Handmaid's Tale. I had a decade and a half of shocking things.
You've resisted the categorization of your work as science fiction because that's all, shiny silver spacesuits and monsters. This is speculative fiction, which is doing something different. And 10 years ago, when I was reading Handmaid's Tale, and I was reading things like extreme regression on women's reproductive rights, highly authoritarian surveillance state, unaccountable executive, is that while, yes, there were sort of little elements here and there, it did feel quite far away from my lived reality. Whereas now you look at what's happening in the States, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in India, and indeed in little pockets over here as well. Somehow the speculative element of speculative fiction seems to disintegrate a bit, and it seems to be more and more like you're holding up a mirror to reality. So what's the role of speculative fiction when it's no longer a speculation and it's how we're living?
Oh, yes. All right, so terminology first. You could put a big banner across the top called Wonder Tales, and then over here there would be another one called The Realistic Novel. So realistic novel, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, Emile Zola, certain books of Charles Dickens were describing what was happening. Over here, Wonder Tales, and under Wonder Tales you could have vampires over here, werewolves next to them, zombies next, fantasy, Lord of the Rings, dragons here, and then you could have transformational stories like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with an element of science. And then you could have the advent of sci-fi. And it had two ancestors. One would be Jules Verne, who wrote about things he thought were really going to happen or had already started to happen. So submarines, air travel, things like that. And then along comes H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, The Time Traveler, things that were not happening and really were very hard to imagine happening. So Martians come to Earth in giant tin cans and eat people. Time travel, you can go to the future and report back on it. And Jules Verne said, Mais il invente. But he's making things up, which he thought was a violation of what he himself, Jules Verne, was doing. So H.G. Wells' descendants went to different planets, saw alien life forms, time traveled, did all of those things. Jules Verne's descendants are Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, 1984 by George Orwell, and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and that is the lineage in which The Handmaid's Tale is. So no matter what you call it, these are two different kinds of book. And I like the other kind. I would like to be able to do dragons and alien life forms. I'm just not good at it. So stick to what you're good at. I would really mess it up. And best dragons are Ursula K. Le Guin's, in case you're looking. So that's where we are. So what happens when what you have written about seems more real? It was always real, because I was taking the details from the past, the present at that time, and looking at technologies that we had just begun to have, and looking at the possibilities for them, which are, of course, now with us. So it wasn't that it wasn't real then. It was that people in certain places in the world thought it wasn't real and were saying things like, it could never happen here. When I wrote it, I thought, well, when I wrote it, it was sort of counter the zeitgeist. It wasn't what people were generally doing then. People weren't writing a lot of literary sci-fi or spec fic at that time either. They were writing, in-depth dives into American society and explorations of, quotes, real life. So it wasn't part of a trend at all. And I thought I would get
the golden era of, Professor has affair with young female student literature.
Well, that era has come again. It seems so. That was the era. So I got three different reactions to it. In England, it was jolly good yarn. In other words, fantasy land. This is certainly not going to happen here, and probably they're right about that in the religious sense, because they had their religious war in the 17th century, and England is unlikely to have a religious war right now. Wars of other kinds, but not that one. Canada, in their nervous way, in their anxious way, they're always pretty anxious, said, could it happen here? A lot of Canadian anxiety is in the form of a question. And in America, there were two. Number one, don't be silly, this will never happen here, ha ha ha. Number two, how long have we got? And the how long have we got seemed to have been more on the money. Somebody spray painted at that time along the Venice beach wall, The Handmaid's Tale is already here.